Hi, my name is Tony Tkáčik. I'm software developer at Evolveum, and I'm currently responsible for the security in MidPoint. I would like to talk to you about securing MidPoint deployments. During this webinar, we will discuss several aspects of securing your deployments, some of which you are probably already familiar with. We will start with basic security concepts for installation and deployment. Then we will continue with default configuration, talk about which parts of the default configuration you should review. We will look into the security concerns regarding the administrator and super administrator accounts. We will move to the expression and mappings and continue with flexible authentication and some potential security issues related to various modules in flexible authentication. We will also touch the networking configuration and HTTPS proxy. And finally, we will talk about the penetration testing, which was done for the MidPoint 4.8, and security fixes which resulted from that. Let's start from the beginning. Installation. This guide doesn't depend if your deployment is done via Docker or installation as a Linux service. And you should take these things into the consideration. During the first installation of your MidPoint, even just for the testing purposes, you should make sure that you are not exporting any HTTP ports to the public infrastructure. You should make sure that only authorized administrators and MidPoint have file system access to the MidPoint home directory. This is the usually var directory. Having read-write access by other users could pose a huge security risk for you. The var lib, conid connectors, and ICF connectors directories are actually used to load executable code. These folders are scanned automatically during the run of the MidPoint, and the code is loaded and executed from here, so they may pose a vector for targeted attack if these folders are not secured properly. The other one is the post-initial objects. It is useful for the customization of your deployment during the startup of the MidPoint, but if this folder is writable by someone else, it actually allows them to inject custom users or even execute bulk actions on the MidPoint restart. The MidPoint home directory also contains other sensitive information, such as credentials to your database, private keys used to encode passwords. So make sure only authorized administrators and MidPoint itself has access. One of the most notable changes in 4.81 and in follow-up releases is that administrator account does not have static password anymore. The password can be configured, or it will be generated according to the password policy. If you want to configure the initial administrator password before, we support several ways to do it. It's using the environment variables, Java properties, or using the config XML. The initial password must conform to the new default password policy. It needs to have at least 8 characters total, 1 uppercase, 1 lowercase, 1 numeric. Special characters, including white spaces, are also supported. And the default lockout timeout for the users is 15 minutes. You can learn more in our documentation. Search for administrator initial password. MidPoint comes with bundle default configuration. Part of this configuration is necessary for proper run of the MidPoint. Parts is just to get you started. Security in default configuration is not the strictest one, so you should review it and customize it according to your needs. You should at least review all pre-configured roles, default security policy, and password value policy. In 4.8.1 and following MidPoint releases, default password policy is stricter than in previous, and was actually designed to be compatible with default Active Directory password policy. One of the pre-configured defaults is the administrator user and super user role. Neither administrator nor super user are meant to be used for day-to-day administration. Once the initial system configuration is done, the administrator user should be disabled, and you should use personalized administration users instead of it, even if they still have the super user role. You may choose to leave administrator enabled for emergency purposes. In that case, you should set it up with very strong random password. Such password should be stored in a secure location and used only for the emergencies. And in this case, do not use initial administrator password for these purposes, even if it was generated randomly. And when you are assigning a super user role to any of the users, you need to consider that this grants unlimited access to the scripting. So it is the same as granting the shell access to the MidPoint service account or Docker container. Let's move to the expression and scripting. Mapping, expressions, and scripting are one of the most powerful features of the MidPoint, but this power comes with great price from the security perspective. You should avoid granting edit access to the mappings and script expressions to non-trusted users. And definitely you should avoid granting access to the mapping playground and query playground to non-super users. If you need to grant the possibility to edit expressions to non-administrator users, you should consider it very carefully, and you should learn more about the expression profiles. Expression profiles allows you to limit what particular expressions can do. You can limit the expressions to particular subset of evaluators. You can limit users to use just basic SIS and PAD expression, or functions from the functions library. In case of the script expressions, the profiles provide you with the option to disable access to the specific Java and Groovy functions. This enforcement only works during the script compile time, so someone creative with edit access to expressions may be able to use the reflection to circumvent these limitations. Actually, writing custom expression profile for Groovy, which will limit all the possibility of manipulating file system and prevent execution of the shell commands, is very hard. MidPoint comes with one expression profile out of the box. It's called safe. This profile allows user to use the SIS, PAD, const value evaluators and limited subset of the Groovy. You can learn more about the expression profile configuration in MidPoint reference, security expression profiles. MidPoint itself is protected from the code injection via user-entered data, regardless of its origin, be it via manually or via resources. But your mappings and your target systems may not be. MidPoint doesn't automatically sanitize any user-entered data, since we do not know their intended use in your mappings. So if you are provisioning data to target systems, you should be aware how these data are used and how you need to sanitize them properly in order to prevent possible code injections. Some of the examples could be, in your mapping, you are generating an LDAP filter, concatenating user-supplied values, and you are not properly escaping it. Or you are provisioning the value of the role description, and the description is editable by users, to simple web application using the DP connector. In this case, you should consider HTML escaping values or stripping script tags in your mapping to avoid possible code injection on the website. You should know your target systems and target resources and consider their security model and vulnerabilities, because you can re-expose these vulnerabilities or actually create a new vulnerabilities via MidPoint indirectly if the provisioned data are not properly sanitized for the target system. In your expression, you also should avoid using any evaluate-like functionality with not processed user input or user data, and you should review your scripts from the security standpoint. Expression profiles also play a role in custom GUI actions. Before MidPoint 4.8, the custom GUI actions required a very high set of the privileges to be used, because in the background is execution of the custom scripts and bulk actions. Since version 4.8, the MidPoint tracks origin of the script and bulk actions, and this allows you to expose some private scripts and actions to less privileged users. In order to configure the custom GUI actions, you need to configure the object collection view with these actions. You need also to configure task templates for these actions and custom archetypes for these task templates, which will assign an expression profile to them. If you want to learn more details and see tutorial how to configure this, search our docs documentation for the trusted bulk actions. Now let's move to the flexible authentication. Flexible authentication allows you to customize your authentication, registration, and password reset flows, but misconfiguration here may lead to serious security vulnerabilities. You should carefully review any changes to your security policies. And if you are configuring remote authentication providers such as OIDC or SAML2, you should consider configuring emergency login. The password reset and identity recovery features are not enabled by default, but they are usually requested for some deployments. These flows should be configured with care, since their presence itself allows for the account enumeration vulnerabilities. Identity recovery is actually an account enumeration. So in its case, the MidPoint tracks disclosed identity in the audit. So if you are using it, you should periodically review your audit logs for these disclosures. These disclosures are audited as information disclosure event type. And you should consider deploying rate limiting proxy if you plan to use these features. The security questions module is not enabled by default. If you need to configure it, you should carefully consider your set of the questions, and you should avoid one which can lead to easily guessable answers, or the answers could be easily looked up, such as the name of the family members, organization position, name of the manager, or the company ID. Also, you should avoid using the security questions as a sufficient authentication method. You should tie them with additional authentication, such as an email, nonce, or other. The self-registration and invitation flows are disabled by default. If you are configuring any of them, you should be very careful. You should review and validate the configuration from security standpoint. The changes done by these flows, which is the user creation or the user modification, are done by unauthorized user using elevated privileges. So you should carefully consider which properties you are exposing to the self-registration. In the custom form, you shouldn't configure any properties which values are managed by your policies or have specific lifecycle in your deployments, because this may allow user to enter incorrect values or skip lifecycle phases. Also, if possible, you should avoid exposing properties which have system-wide unique values, such as a name or login name, to registration form directly, because that actually is also potential attack vector for the account enumeration attack. And malicious user can try to register under different names and see if their registration failed in order to discover existing accounts. And you should consider deploying rate limiting proxy for the registration. Let's talk about the networking. In any production, you should always use HTTPS. You should make sure that MidPoint is only accessible on the port 443 via HTTPS, and make sure to not expose port 8080 to the public internet. When deploying the HTTPS proxy, consider multiple use cases of your MidPoint. Do you need REST APIs or Spring Actuator to be available from the same address as the GUI? If not, you should configure your proxy to not expose them. If you want to harden your HTTPS configuration, you should also consider configuring HTTP strict transport security on your proxy. And optionally, you should configure a secure attribute for JSession ID cookie. This also needs to be done on the proxy. As mentioned before, for some use cases, rate limiting proxy is recommended. MidPoint doesn't have a built-in rate limiter for unauthorized users. So you should consider it if you are using the functionality which may expose account enumeration indirectly. That was the password reset, identity recovery, registration, invitation flows. If you are considering to configure the rate limiting, you can use the IP address or JSession ID as the rate limiting key. Also, you should test your rate limiting configuration and make sure only the password reset, identity recovery, or registration endpoints are rate limited. In very secure deployments, there may be a need to deploy the outbound firewall, the firewall which blocks connections from MidPoint to the outside world or other machines. In this case, you should remember that for MidPoint to properly operate, it needs to have a network access to the database, other MidPoint nodes if you are using the cluster, and all the resources the MidPoint is configured to connect to. Okay, so let's continue with the penetration testing and the security fixes which resulted from them. MidPoint 4.8 was penetration tested during its development by Radically Open Security, thanks to the funding by NGI Zero Review program. This resulted in various security fixes in MidPoint 4.8 and 4.8.1. The penetration testing showed that a lot of possible vulnerabilities were deployment-specific, misconfigurations, or insecure configurations. This actually prompted creating this webinar to warn you about some pitfalls, and also proved or showed that the penetration testing should be deployment-specific. In 4.8, we introduced fixes for stored cross-site scripting vulnerability in audit details. The fix is clickjacking. This is the embedding MidPoint in iframe from subdomain. And we introduced the content security policy, but the not strictest one. In 4.8.1, we introduced already mentioned new default password policy, and we removed hard-coded administrator password. We fixed cross-site request forgery for logout. We added the options to not report stack traces to the end users. And we fixed vulnerability in invitation flow, which allowed the attacker to create accounts even if they were not invited. Our internal code audit also showed potential vulnerabilities in REST APIs and expression execution, which prompted the release 4.8.2. We fixed the vulnerabilities where the users with access to the REST could execute script so before the authorizations were applied by specially crafted MidPoint objects. We also introduced more granular REST permissions and fixed the access to the hidden panels by URL manipulation. What's next with the security features? In MidPoint 4.9, we will introduce secrets providers, which will allow you to load the secrets, such as administrator password, resource passwords, from external sources. MidPoint will have a few built-in providers out of the box, support for the Docker secrets, environment variables, and file providers. Custom providers will also be supported. And if you want to learn more about these upcoming features, search our documentation for the secrets provider. Generally, you can learn more in our documentation at docs.evolveum.com. Section MidPoint Security contains the documentation about general security concepts and contains the actually released security advisories. The MidPoint Reference Security contains the configuration details about the security-related features. And you should also consider subscribing to the MidPoint mailing list, where we announce and release the security advisories for discovered vulnerabilities in MidPoint. Thank you for your attention.